He came to the coast to let the sea scour the rust from his soul. The salt air was a constant, abrasive truth against his skin, a welcome replacement for the cloying humidity of remembered jungles and the bone-dry air of forgotten deserts. Elias Thorne had traded a world of shouted commands and the sharp crack of breaking sound barriers for the long, slow roar of the Pacific. It was a trade he considered fair, most days. The memories still came, of course. They were ghosts that water could not drown, hitching rides on the evening fog and whispering in the cry of gulls. But here, on this strip of forgotten land called Cape Solitude, they had less room to breathe. He lived in a small, weathered cabin perched on a low cliff, a sentinel of cedar and glass facing the endless gray. His routine was a bulwark against the chaos that lived behind his eyes. Up before the sun, a methodical check of his gear, a long walk along the shore, and the quiet companionship of the only creature whose presence he could tolerate. Ghost sat beside him now on the damp porch steps, a statue carved from shadow and smoke. The German shepherd was old, his muzzle a distinguished silver gray, his movements deliberate and economical. He was not a pet. He was a partner, the last remnant of a life Elias was trying to forget. They had served together, breathed the same dust in faraway lands, and understood each other with a clarity that words only served to cloud. Elias wore his uniform of exile, a faded olive M65 field jacket, its collar turned up against the persistent coastal chill, a red and black plaid flannel shirt, and cargo pants worn soft with use. On his wrist, the heavy, tritium-loomed face of his marathon military watch was a constant, glowing reminder of a world measured in unforgiving seconds. His worn leather boots were laced tight, ready. He was always ready, even if he no longer knew for what. He sipped his black coffee from a tin mug, the heat a small point of comfort in the vast, indifferent morning. Ghost did not look at him, but Elias felt the dog's awareness, a low, steady hum of energy beside him. The shepherd's gaze was fixed on the churning water, his posture one of placid observation. But it was a professional placidity. Ghost was never entirely off duty. The dog's head lifted suddenly, a subtle shift. His ears, which had been relaxed, now swiveled forward, two perfect triangles aimed at the wind. His breathing, a slow and even cadence, hitched for a single beat. Elias felt it more than he saw it, a tremor in the force that bound them. He set his mug down on the wooden step, the metallic clink unnaturally loud in the quiet air. He followed the dog's line of sight, scanning the beach below. There was nothing, just the usual debris line of kelp and driftwood, the chaotic scribble of seabird tracks in the wet sand, the endless push and pull of the tide. "What is it, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Ghost didn't respond. He simply remained, a study in tension. His focus was unnerving. In their shared past, that posture had preceded the scent of hidden explosives, the whisper of an unseen enemy. Here, on this deserted stretch of coast, it felt alien. Elias trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. His own had been compromised long ago, clouded by a single, catastrophic decision made under a sun the color of brass. Ghost's senses, however, were pure. They dealt only in the immediate truth of what was, not in the regret of what had been. A cold finger of unease traced its way down Elias's spine. Something was wrong. The mountain-sized waves held their breath, the wind carried a new scent, and the silence suddenly had teeth. For 3 days, the feeling persisted. It was a low hum beneath the surface of their quiet life, an unresolved chord in the symphony of the sea. Ghost remained vigilant. On their walks, he would pause at the same stretch of beach, a wide, sweeping cove a mile south of the cabin, and lift his nose to the wind, a low rumble sometimes vibrating in his chest. Elias could see nothing, smell nothing but salt and decaying seaweed. He used his binoculars, scanning the tree line, the water, the rocks. He saw only the familiar landscape, yet he did not dismiss it. He packed his Eberly stock half-track with a little more care each morning, adding a medical kit and extra rations. Discipline was an anchor, and he held to it tightly. On the fourth day, the sky turned the color of a bruise. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with a strange electric stillness. The gulls fell silent, taking shelter inland. The sea, which had been a restless gray, turned a malevolent, oily black, its surface unnaturally smooth, as if the world were holding its breath before a scream. Elias and Ghost stood on the porch and watched the storm roll in. It wasn't a squall. It was an invasion. A solid wall of cloud and rain advanced from the horizon, devouring the light. "Looks like we're staying in," Elias said. Ghost responded with a soft whine, pressing against his leg, his amber eyes fixed on the approaching fury. They retreated inside, the first fat drops of rain striking the windows like thrown stones. The storm was a living thing. For 2 days and nights, it threw itself against the small cabin, a relentless, primal rage. The wind shrieked like a tortured animal, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The ocean roared, a constant concussive thunder that vibrated through the floorboards and into Elias's bones. He and Ghost existed in a small bubble of light and warmth. The generator humming in the shed outside, the wood stove crackling. Elias read old paperbacks and cleaned his gear, his movements slow and deliberate. Ghost slept fitfully at his feet, his paws twitching, his sleep punctuated by low growls as if he were fighting battles in his dreams. Through it all, Elias felt a strange sense of calm. This was a straightforward enemy, a physical force to be endured, not a moral labyrinth to be navigated. He understood the storm. On the morning of the third day, he awoke to silence, a profound, ringing quiet that felt heavier than the noise it had replaced. The wind had died. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the distant, exhausted sigh of the surf. He rose and went to the window. The world was remade. The sky was washed clean, a pale, fragile blue. The rising sun cast long, dramatic shadows across a landscape that had been violently rearranged. Trees were down. The path to the beach was gone, replaced by a muddy cascade of earth and stone. The beach itself was unrecognizable. The storm had acted like a giant hand, scouring away tons of sand and flinging boulders around like pebbles. After a quick breakfast, they went out. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet earth and ozone. They navigated the new, treacherous terrain down to the shore. The tide was at an extreme low, pulled back by the same forces that had driven the storm, exposing a vast, alien-looking plain of rock and sand that was usually deep underwater. It was in the southern cove, the place of Ghost's strange fixation, that the true extent of the change was visible. A huge section of the low, sandy cliff had collapsed, revealing a dark, raw scar of rock and clay. They walked the new tide line, the sand underfoot firm and rippled. Ghost trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, his entire being focused. He was no longer just vigilant. He was hunting. Elias watched him, his old instincts flaring to life. This was it. Whatever the dog had sensed was here, now, uncovered. Ghost stopped abruptly near the base of the collapsed cliff. He stood rigid, his head down, his tail a straight, low line. He did not bark or whine. He simply stood, a living arrow pointing to a single spot on the ground. Elias approached slowly. He knelt beside the dog, placing a hand on his back. The muscles there were coiled steel. "Show me," he said softly. As if the words were a release, Ghost began to dig. Not with frantic energy, but with a focused, powerful purpose. Sand and wet shell flew from beneath his paws. He was digging at the base of something dark and curved, a shape that Elias had initially mistaken for a large, water-worn boulder. After a few moments, Ghost's paws met the object with a dull, scraping sound. He stopped, looked back at Elias, and let out a single, sharp bark. Elias took over. He pulled a small entrenching tool from a pouch on his pack and began to clear the sand away from the object. The morning sun glinted off it. It was not rock. It was metal. Rusted, pitted, covered in barnacles and marine growth, but unmistakably metal. It was curved, a smooth, engineered arc that had no place in the natural chaos of the shore. He worked methodically, his breath misting in the cold air. He followed the curve, digging a trench around it. The shape grew, expanding under his hands. It was a vast, cylindrical form. He cleared a wider area, and his shovel struck something else. A smaller, vertical piece of metal. A rung. Part of a ladder. He stepped back, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the curve of the massive hull, the ladder rungs ascending to a flat, oblong platform. He saw the thick, armored glass of viewports, now opaque with grime. He saw the unmistakable shape of a sail, or a conning tower, canted at a strange angle, half buried in the rock and clay of the cliff face itself. It was impossible. It was absurd. But it was undeniably real. Buried in the shoreline of Cape Solitude was a submarine. It wasn't an ancient relic. The design was wrong. It was too sleek, too angular. Cold War, maybe later. He ran a hand over the cold, rough steel. It felt like the flank of a dead whale. There were no markings, no numbers, no insignia visible beneath the crust of the sea. It was a ghost ship, beached by a storm, its secrets exposed to the light of a new day. Ghost sat beside him, calm now, his work done. He looked from the submarine to Elias, his expression one of patient expectation, as if to say, "Well, here it is. What are you going to do now?" For an hour, Elias did nothing but observe. His training took over, pushing back the wave of disbelief. He walked the perimeter of the exposed section, his eyes cataloging every detail. The sub was wedged deep into the shoreline, its stern buried in the collapsed cliff, its bow pointing out toward the low tide line. It hadn't washed ashore. The angle was wrong. The damage to the cliff suggested it had been driven here, intentionally, with immense force, and then buried by time and tide. It was an act of deliberate concealment, not a wreck. He found a hatch on the dorsal side near the base of the sail. It was massive, a wheel-lock design crusted with rust. He put his shoulder to it, but it was sealed as tight as the rock around it. He continued his survey, his boots crunching on the shells and sand. Near the bow, half submerged in a tide pool, he saw another hatch, smaller, set flush with the hull. This one looked different. One of the locking dogs was bent, twisted outward at an unnatural angle, as if it had been strained from the inside. The storm, perhaps, the immense pressure of the shifting earth and water, might have sprung it. He waded into the knee-deep water, the cold a sharp shock. Ghost followed, whining softly, a note of concern in his voice. Elias examined the hatch. He wedged the tip of his entrenching tool into the small gap near the damaged lock. He put his weight on it, leveraging it. The metal groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to echo from a long-forgotten time. He felt a slight give. He reset his tool, found a better purchase, and pushed again, his muscles straining. With a final agonized shriek of tortured steel, the hatch popped open a few inches, releasing a bubble of stale, foul-smelling air. The smell hit him like a physical blow. It was the scent of contained emptiness, of stagnant water, dead air, and old machinery. It was the smell of a tomb. He worked the tool for another 10 minutes, slowly prying the heavy hatch open far enough to squeeze through. He paused, looking back at the bright, clean world outside. Ghost stood at the edge of the tide pool, watching him, his body tense. Elias pulled a powerful flashlight from his pack. "Stay," he commanded. The dog sat, but his eyes never left the dark opening. Elias swung his legs into the hole and lowered himself down. His feet found a ladder. The interior was pitch black. He switched on his flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a clean white circle in the oppressive darkness. He was in a small compartment, a forward torpedo room by the look of it. The great cylindrical tubes were empty, their hatches sealed. Emergency lights on the bulkheads were shattered. A thin layer of slimy water covered the deck plating. The air was cold, damp, and unnervously still. He moved slowly, carefully, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. He was a ghost in a ghost ship. He moved aft through a narrow hatchway into a cramped berthing area. Bunks were stacked 3 high, their thin mattresses stained with mildew. A few tattered paperbacks lay on the floor, their pages swollen and warped. In a small galley, he found cans of food stacked neatly on shelves, their labels long since dissolved. It was orderly, too orderly for a wreck. There was no sign of panic, no evidence of a struggle for survival. It looked like a place that had been deliberately, methodically abandoned. He found the control room. It was the heart of the vessel, a dense knot of gauges, screens, and levers. Here, the sense of stillness was most profound. The needles of the depth gauges were all resting on 0. The throttle levers were locked in the neutral position. A single chair, bolted to the floor in front of the main helm, was empty. On a small chart table, held down by a rusted paperweight, was a logbook. Elias picked it up. The cover was stiff with damp, but the pages inside, though yellowed, were mostly legible. The writing was a neat, precise script. He shone his light on the first page. Day 730. 2 years. The entries were sparse, technical, positional data, atmospheric pressure, water temperature. No mention of a mission, no hint of a purpose. The dates continued, relentlessly. Day 854. Day 921. Day 1095. 3 years. The submarine, it seemed, had simply sat here, silent and waiting. He flipped toward the end of the book. The handwriting began to change. It grew less precise, more hurried. The entries became more personal. Day 1245. The signal has not come. Provisions are low, but morale is the greater concern. The silence is a pressure greater than the sea. A few pages later. Day 1262. We held a vote. The order was to scuttle, to let the sea take the vessel and its cargo, to erase ourselves. But the captain refuses. He says some things should not be erased. He says a reckoning is owed. The final entry was written in a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. It was dated over 30 years ago. Day 1270. The Cliffs of Solitude. The captain is taking her in, a final, desperate act of preservation. He calls it a time capsule, a tomb with a message for the future. He has sealed the cargo. He says the truth needs to sleep, but it must not die. We go ashore at dawn. God help us. God help us all. Cargo. The word stood out. This wasn't just a submarine. It was a vault. Elias looked around the control room. On one bulkhead was a heavy reinforced door with a complex locking mechanism, like that of a bank vault. It was a separate shielded compartment. Whatever the crew had sought to preserve was in there. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was the custodian of someone else's. He knew he couldn't get into that sealed room, and he knew he couldn't leave this place as it was. The next storm, the next big tide, could bury it again for another 30 years, or rip it apart and scatter its secrets into the ocean. He backed out of the control room, his mind racing. He needed information. He needed context. He needed to know what this ship was and why its existence had been so carefully erased. He climbed back out into the dazzling sunlight, blinking as his eyes adjusted. Ghost was waiting exactly where he had left him, a silent, loyal sentinel. The dog nudged his hand with a wet nose, then looked past him, toward the town that lay nestled in the hills miles down the coast. The message was clear. The answers weren't here, in this metal tomb. They were out there, with the world of men. Elias took a deep breath of the clean, salt air, the stench of the submarine still clinging to him. He looked at the logbook in his hand, at the final, desperate entry. A tomb with a message. He had found it. Now he had to decipher it. The town of Port Blossom was a 20-mile drive down a winding coastal highway. It was a small, quiet place that seemed to exist in a slightly different decade from the rest of the world. Its main street was lined with brick buildings housing a hardware store, a diner, and a handful of small shops. Elias felt conspicuous as he parked his old pickup truck. He was an outsider, a ghost of a different sort, and the few people on the street watched him with a placid, small-town curiosity. He found the Clallam County Records Office in a squat stone building that also served as the town hall. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor wax. A tall, spare woman with sharp blue eyes and gray hair pulled back in a severe bun sat behind a high wooden counter. She watched him approach, her expression neutral but appraising. A small engraved plaque on the counter read, "Martha Galloway, County Clerk." "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, no nonsense. Elias felt the familiar reluctance to speak, to engage. He cleared his throat. "I'm looking for old maps, surveys, maybe, of the coastline north of here. Cape Solitude." Martha Galloway raised a single, skeptical eyebrow. "That's federal land, most of it. Old Lighthouse Reserve. Not much to survey." "Why?" He had prepared for this. "I'm a hobbyist, a geologist, interested in the patterns of erosion after the storm." It felt like a lie, and he was a poor liar. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze lingering on the worn fabric of his field jacket, the disciplined stillness of his posture. He could feel her cataloging him, assessing him. She wasn't buying it, but she also didn't dismiss him. "We have coastal survey maps going back to the founding of the county."
"What era are you interested in?"
"Last 30, 40 years, he said. "Anything showing significant changes to the shoreline, wrecks, things like that." She turned, her movements efficient, and pulled a large bound ledger from a shelf behind her. She opened it on the counter, her long fingers tracing the index. "Shipwrecks are usually federal jurisdiction, Coast Guard records. But we'd have a note if something major happened close to shore, for insurance and land deed purposes." She ran her finger down a page. "There was the Sea Serpent, a fishing trawler, went down in a squall in '98. A sailboat, the Wanderer, hit the rocks in 2003. Nothing unusual. Nothing on the scale of what that last storm did." She looked up at him. "You find something out there, didn't you?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. Elias met her gaze. He made a decision, a calculated risk based on the steady intelligence in her eyes. He opened his pack and took out the logbook.
He didn't hand it to her. He just laid it on the counter.
"It's from a submarine," he said quietly.
Her eyes widened just for a second before her professional composure returned. She looked at the book, then back at him. She didn't ask to see it. She didn't ask where he found it. She simply processed the information. "There has never been a submarine reported lost or wrecked on this coast," she said, her voice low and certain. "Not in the last 100 years. "I know," Elias said. She tapped a thoughtful finger on the counter. She seemed to be making her own calculation. "There's one person in this town who might be able to help you make sense of something like that. He's not official. In fact, most people think he's a little crazy." She scribbled an address on a small notepad. "Dr. Alistair Finch. He's a retired naval architect and a maritime historian.
Knows more about what's lying on the bottom of the ocean than any man alive."
She pushed the paper across the counter. "Tell him Martha sent you. And be careful. Some things are buried for a reason." Dr. Finch lived in a cluttered house at the edge of town, a place that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the encroaching forest and piles of books. The man who answered the door was in his late 70s, with a wild mane of white hair, bright, inquisitive eyes behind thick glasses, and a cardigan sweater stained with ink and what looked like tea. "Martha sent you?" he said, his voice a reedy baritone. "Well, don't just stand there, man. Come in. Unless you're selling something, in which case go away." Elias stepped inside. The house was a labyrinth of books. They were stacked on shelves, piled on the floor, overflowing from tables and chairs. The air smelled of dust, old paper, and pipe tobacco.
Finch gestured toward the only clear surface, a small section of a massive oak table covered in nautical charts. "What great mystery has our formidable clerk sent you to me with?" Without a word, Elias placed the logbook on the table. Finch's eyes lit up. He picked it up with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. He adjusted his glasses, his hands surprisingly steady as he opened the cover. He read the first page, then the second. He let out a low whistle. Day 730. Good heavens. He flipped through the pages, his breathing growing faster. He looked up at Elias, his academic curiosity warring with sheer astonishment. "Where did you get this?" "From the vessel it belongs to," Elias said. "It's beached in a cove on Cape Solitude. The storm uncovered it." Finch sank into a chair, his eyes wide. "Beached? Not sunk? A whole vessel?" He shook his head, a slow, wondrous motion. "Tell me everything." Elias described the submarine. Its sleek, angular design, the absence of markings, the strange way it was wedged into the cliff. Finch listened, his head cocked, a forensic scientist hearing the details of a fascinating crime. When Elias finished, Finch was silent for a long time. He went to a bookshelf and pulled down a thick, obscure-looking volume. Jane's Fighting Ships, 1985. He flipped through it, then pulled down another, and another. "It's not in here," he said, more to himself than to Elias. "Nothing matching that description was ever commissioned. Not officially." He looked up, a spark in his eye. "Which means it was a black project, a ghost." There were rumors in the late 70s, early 80s, a new class of deep submergent surveillance vessel. They were calling it the Sentinel class. The idea was to build a submarine that could lie on the seabed, completely silent, for years at a time. A passive listening post, powered by a next-generation radioisotope thermoelectric generator. It could monitor shipping, communications, anything. A permanent, invisible spy. He paced the small, clear space in his study. The project was supposedly canceled. Too expensive, too risky. But what if it wasn't? What if they built one? A prototype?
and they sent it on a mission, a deep, long-term deployment. And then, they just left it there. The log says the order was to scuttle, Elias said, but the captain refused. He preserved it. The cargo, Finch whispered, his eyes distant. The final log entry mentioned cargo. If this boat was a listening post for 3 years, my God, the data it would have collected. Tapes, film, 3 years of secrets recorded and stored. He looked at Elias, his expression one of awe and terror. This isn't a shipwreck, my boy. It's a time bomb. There's a sealed compartment in the control room, Elias told him. I couldn't get in. Finch nodded slowly. Of course. Shielded against espionage or destruction.
It would take specialized equipment. But the log is the key. He spent the next hour poring over the book, cross-referencing the sparse positional data with his own charts. He muttered about magnetic declinations and forgotten Cold War listening arrays. Finally, he sat back. The mission wasn't foreign surveillance, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Based on these positions, they were sitting in the Juan de Fuca Strait. They were pointed inland. They were spying on us. Domestic soil. A secret, illegal surveillance program on a scale that is unimaginable. That's why they were ordered to scuttle. That's why the crew was meant to disappear. The captain didn't just save a submarine. He saved the evidence of a profound betrayal. A heavy silence fell over the room. Elias felt the weight of it, the sheer gravity of what lay inside that rusted hull. It was a story of a moral choice made by a man 30 years ago. A captain who chose truth over orders. It was a choice that resonated with the discordant notes of Elias's own past, the choice he had failed to make. What do we do? Elias asked. The question hung in the dusty air. Before Finch could answer, a sleek black sedan, utterly out of place in this quiet town, pulled up in front of the house. The engine was nearly silent. A man in a sharp, tailored suit got out. He was in his late 40s, with neatly combed hair and a calm, pleasant smile. He walked up the path and knocked on the door, a polite, confident rap. Finch looked at Elias, his face pale. It seems the bomb has a fuse, he whispered. And someone has just come to light it. Elias moved to the window, peering through a gap in the books. The man stood patiently on the porch, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look like a government agent, not the kind Elias was used to. He looked like a banker or a corporate lawyer. He radiated an aura of expensive, unassailable confidence. Ghost, who had been waiting quietly in Elias's truck, was now standing, his body rigid, a low, almost inaudible growl vibrating from his chest. The dog knew. Finch answered the door. Yes? The man smiled, a smooth, practiced expression that didn't reach his eyes. Dr. Alistair Finch? My name is Sterling. I'm with the North American Maritime Heritage Group. I believe you may have something that belongs to us. Or, more accurately, information about something. His gaze flicked past Finch into the room and settled on Elias. There was a flicker of recognition, or perhaps just assessment. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Finch said, his voice a little shaky. This is a private residence. Sterling smiled, didn't falter. Of course. But we have reason to believe a recently uncovered naval asset has come to your attention. An asset we have been tasked with reclaiming. He used the word reclaiming as if he were talking about a misplaced library book. It's a delicate matter. One of historical preservation. We'd be very grateful for your cooperation.
Elias stepped forward, moving into the doorway beside Finch. He was taller than Sterling, and his presence, though quiet, was a solid, unmoving wall. Sterling's gaze shifted to him fully. He took in the field jacket, the hard, quiet set of Elias's face, the lifetime of discipline in his posture. "And you are?" Sterling asked, his tone still perfectly pleasant. "He's the man who found your asset," Elias said. His own voice sounded foreign to him, a tool he hadn't used for this purpose in a long time. Sterling's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, the geologist. Yes, we were told someone was asking questions in town." The "we" was chillingly vague. "Then you can appreciate the sensitivity of the situation. This vessel contains materials that are, let's say, historically complex. They could be easily misinterpreted in the current climate.
Our job is simply to secure them, to put them back in their proper archival context."
"You mean bury them," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Sterling's smile tightened. "I mean preserve them from irresponsible hands. A find like this requires professional handling, not amateur enthusiasm." He looked from Elias's impassive face to Finch's nervous one. "Look, let's be reasonable. Our organization is prepared to offer a substantial finder's fee. A grant, Dr. Finch, for your historical research. And for you, Mr. He let the question hang. "Thorne," Elias supplied. "Mr. Thorne, a generous compensation for your time and discretion. You walk away, forget what you saw, and allow the professionals to handle their business. Everyone wins." It was the language of quiet corruption, of deals made in boardrooms to erase inconvenient truths. It was smooth, reasonable, and utterly soulless.
Elias thought of the final entry in the logbook, the captain's desperate act to ensure the truth would one day surface. He thought of the weight of 1,270 days of silence in that cold, dark hull. "The captain of that boat made a choice," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "He chose to preserve the truth, not sell it. I'm not going to be the one to betray him now." For the first time, Sterling's composure cracked. A flash of cold anger sparked in his eyes before being quickly suppressed. "You are making a mistake, Mr. Thorne. You are interfering with a sanctioned recovery operation. You are in possession of a classified military document." He gestured toward the logbook still on Finch's table. "I could have the authorities here in 20 minutes. "Then call them," Elias said. "The real ones. The Coast Guard. The Navy. Let's have a public conversation about a secret, illegal domestic spying program from the Cold War." "I'm sure that would go over well." Sterling stared at him, the pleasant mask gone completely. His face was cold and hard. "You have no idea what you're meddling with. This is not a game. There are no heroes here, just history. And history is heavy. It can crush people." He took a step back, his posture shifting from negotiation to threat. "I'm going to give you 12 hours. By sunrise tomorrow, my team will be at that site to begin the reclamation. I strongly advise you not to be there." He turned without another word and walked back to his silent car. As he drove away, Elias felt the oppressive weight of the man's promise. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. He looked at Finch, who was leaning against the doorframe, looking shaken. "Martha was right," Finch said, his voice trembling slightly. "Some things are buried for a reason. And some things need to be dug up," Elias countered. He felt a strange clarity, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The ghosts in his head were silent for once, pushed aside by the urgency of the present. He had a new mission. Not one assigned by a commander, but one he was choosing for himself. Protect the Sentinel. Protect the truth. He looked out at the road where Sterling's car had disappeared. The polite threats were over. The storm was coming back. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Finch, galvanized by a mix of academic fury and righteous indignation, worked the phone. He called colleagues, old contacts at the Naval Archives, a journalist he trusted at a major newspaper. He spoke in hypotheticals, feeding them pieces of the story, planting seeds of inquiry. Imagine a vessel, unregistered, surfacing after 30 years. What would the protocol be? Who would have jurisdiction? He was building a firewall of curiosity, hoping to make the submarine's existence too public to be easily erased. Elias, meanwhile, prepared for a different kind of engagement. He went back to his cabin. He packed his backpack with everything he would need for a long night. Thermal blankets, rations, water, a more powerful medical kit, rope, and a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters he kept in his shed. He checked the charge on his satellite phone. He was moving with the quiet, methodical efficiency of his old life. The motions were automatic, muscle memory from 100 other nights spent preparing for a confrontation. But this felt different. This time, the objective wasn't to neutralize a target or secure a compound. It was to stand guard over a dead man's conscience. He sat on his porch as dusk fell, cleaning his folding knife, the rhythmic scrape of the whetstone a calming sound. Ghost lay at his feet, awake and watchful. The dog hadn't relaxed since Sterling's visit. He seemed to understand the shift in the atmosphere, the coiling of tension. Elias looked down at him, at the loyal, intelligent eyes that had seen him through the worst moments of his life. "Just one more watch, boy," he murmured. Ghost rested his heavy head on Elias's boot, a simple, profound gesture of solidarity. As darkness settled over the Cape, Elias made one more call. He dialed his sister's number, a number he had ignored for months. She answered on the second ring, her voice a mix of relief and frustration. "Elias? Is that you? Do you have any idea how worried I've been?" "I'm okay, Sarah," he said, his voice tight. "Listen, I might be out of touch for a day or two. I need you to do something for me." He gave her the name and number of the journalist Finch had contacted. "If you don't hear from me by noon tomorrow, I need you to call him. Tell him everything. About Cape Solitude, the submarine, a man named Sterling. Everything." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Elias, what's going on?" "What have you gotten yourself into now?" Her voice was filled with a familiar, weary fear. "I'm getting myself out of something," he said, and he was surprised to find that he meant it. "I'll call you when it's over. I promise." He hung up before she could argue, before his own resolve could waver. He had set his own dead man's switch, a final contingency. He and Ghost made their way back to the southern cove under the light of a sliver of moon. The tide was coming in, the waves whispering against the shore. The submarine was a great, dark beast, a leviathan sleeping in the moonlight. Elias found a defensible position in the rocks high on the cliff overlooking the beach, a natural alcove that gave him a clear view of the entire cove while keeping him concealed. He laid out a thermal blanket for Ghost and settled in for the long wait. The night was cold and clear. The stars were brilliant, hard points of light in the infinite black. It was the kind of night that made a man feel small. But for the first time in a long time, Elias didn't feel insignificant. He felt anchored. He had a place to be, a line to hold. They came just after 3 a.m., not in a silent black sedan,
but in two large, unmarked work trucks that rumbled down a barely there access road Elias hadn't even known existed. The headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the beach before being extinguished. Doors opened and closed quietly. 6 men, including Sterling, emerged. They were dressed in dark work clothes. They moved with a practiced, professional efficiency that spoke of experience. This wasn't their first reclamation. Sterling stood apart, directing the operation with quiet hand signals. The other men began unloading equipment from the trucks. Heavy-duty winches, cutting torches, large, sealed containers. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a military bearing, seemed to be the foreman. He was giving low-voiced commands to the others.
Elias watched them through his binoculars, his body tense. This was the team, and their conflicted insider, Davis, was likely among them. He just didn't know who yet. They set up powerful battery-operated floodlights, and the cove was suddenly bathed in a harsh, sterile glare. The submarine looked stark and vulnerable under the artificial light. The men went to work immediately, their objective clear: to get into the sealed cargo hold, remove the contents, and then cut the hull into manageable pieces to be hauled away. They were here to sanitize history. Elias remained hidden, watching. His plan was not to fight them. He couldn't. It was 6 against 1. His plan was to be a witness, to document, to delay, to hold the line until sunrise when Finch's calls and his own contingency might bring help. He had his satellite phone ready, set to record video. The team ignored the sprung-forward hatch Elias had used. They went straight for the main conning tower hatch. One of the men produced a portable plasma cutter. With a hiss and a shower of brilliant orange sparks, he began to slice through the rusted locking wheel. The noise was surprisingly loud in the night, a violent desecration of the cove's peace. Ghost, beside Elias, let out a low, guttural growl, the sound vibrating through the rock. "Easy, boy," Elias whispered, his hand on the dog's neck. As the men worked, the weather began to turn. The wind picked up, coming in cold, wet gusts. The stars disappeared behind a fast-moving bank of clouds. The sea grew agitated, its whispers turning into angry hisses as the waves clawed higher up the beach. Another storm was brewing, a smaller, quicker squall, but a storm nonetheless. It seemed as if the Cape itself was rising up to defend its secret. The plasma cutter finished its work. With a heavy groan, the main hatch was pried open. 2 men, wearing harnesses and carrying lights, descended into the submarine. Sterling watched them, his face impassive, illuminated by the floodlights. After a few minutes, one of the men reappeared. He spoke to Sterling, gesturing back into the hatch. Sterling nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. They had reached the control room. They were at the vault door. This was the moment. Elias knew he had to do something to slow them down. He looked around his position. Above him, a section of the cliff was unstable, a jumble of loose rock and earth left precarious by the last storm. A carefully placed push, a dislodged boulder, could create a small landslide, not enough to harm anyone, but enough to block the beach access between the trucks and the submarine, creating chaos and delay. He gave Ghost a quiet command to stay and began to climb, moving silently through the darkness. He found a large, balanced rock that seemed to be a keystone for the unstable section. It would work. He was about to put his shoulder to it when he heard a sharp yelp from below. He froze, his heart seizing in his chest. It was Ghost. He scrambled back to his post, his mind racing. What had happened? A snake? A fall? He looked down at the beach, and he saw it. Ghost was no longer in the alcove. He was on the beach, near the waterline, his body contorted in a strange way. One of Sterling's men was standing over him. It was the foreman, the one with the military bearing. He was holding a long pole, a catch pole, the kind used by animal control. He must have seen or heard Ghost. He had come up to neutralize the threat.
but something had gone wrong. As the tide surged, a large piece of driftwood, a massive log the size of a telephone pole, had been lifted by a wave and rolled, pinning Ghost's hind leg against a jagged rock. The dog was trapped. The foreman was trying to get the catch pole around his neck, but Ghost was snapping at him, his fear and pain making him aggressive. Sterling shouted from the submarine, "Davis, leave the dog!
Get back to work."
The foreman, Davis, hesitated. He looked at the trapped, struggling animal, then back at the rising tide. Another wave crashed in, higher this time, submerging Ghost's trapped leg completely. The dog cried out, a sound of pure agony that cut through Elias like a knife. And in that moment, Elias was no longer on a cold beach in the Pacific Northwest. He was back in the dust and heat of Afghanistan. He saw the face of the young SEAL, Corporal Evans, trapped under the wreckage of a collapsed building, his leg pinned. The mission was to recover the intel from the target's laptop. The building was unstable. The enemy was closing in. The order came down from his commander. Leave him. Retrieve the asset. And Elias had obeyed. He had taken the laptop and left Evans behind as the building crumbled. He had chosen the mission over the man. It was the correct tactical decision. It had earned him a medal. And it had broken him completely.
He looked from the submarine, the vessel holding the truth he had sworn to protect, to his dog, his partner, trapped and in pain, the water rising around him. The mission or the man? The mission or the dog? History was not just heavy, it was cruel. It had given him the same choice, a different setting, a different life at stake. Sterling was yelling again, his voice sharp with impatience. "Davis, now!" Davis looked torn. He was a soldier. Elias could see it in his stance. He was used to following orders. But he was also looking at the dog, and Elias could see the conflict in his eyes. Paragraph. Elias did not hesitate, not this time. There was no calculation. There was no weighing of options. There was only a cold, absolute certainty. He slid down the cliff face, sending a shower of pebbles onto the beach. He landed in a crouch and sprinted toward the waterline. "Get away from him," Elias snarled, his voice a low growl that was more animal than human. Davis backed away, startled, holding the catchpole like a weapon. Sterling and his other men turned, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. They started moving toward him. Elias ignored them. He reached Ghost. The dog was frantic, but the moment he saw Elias, he stopped struggling, a soft whine of relief escaping him. "I've got you, boy," Elias whispered, his hands going to the massive log. The water was thigh-deep now, frigid and powerful. Each wave tried to tear him from his footing. He put his shoulder to the log, his feet sinking into the wet sand as he pushed. It didn't budge. It was too heavy. Sterling's men were closing in. "Thorne, get out of the way!" Sterling shouted. "This is your last warning!" Elias ignored him. He looked at the trapped leg, the rock, the log. He needed leverage. He saw another, smaller piece of driftwood nearby. He grabbed it, wedging it under the main log. He put all his weight on it, his back screaming in protest. The log lifted, just an inch, but it was enough. "Go, Ghost! Get out!" he yelled. Ghost scrambled free, dragging his injured leg. He collapsed on the wet sand, clear of the water, and began licking his wound. Elias let the log fall back with a heavy splash. He stood up, breathing heavily, the cold water swirling around him. He turned to face Sterling and his team. They had stopped, their path blocked by his sudden, desperate action. In that moment of standoff, something unexpected happened. On the deck of the submarine, a brilliant flash of light was followed by a loud bang and a plume of thick, acrid smoke.
The plasma cutter, which had been left near the vault door, had just exploded. The floodlights flickered and died, plunging the beach back into near darkness, lit only by the distant, useless headlights of the trucks and the growing storm. Sterling swore, spinning around. "What was that?" From the top of the cliff, a voice yelled down. "Sir!"
The generator for the cutter just blew. Elias looked at Davis, the foreman. The man was staring at the submarine, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He hadn't been near the equipment, but he had been a soldier. He knew about sabotage. He knew how a fuel line could be accidentally crimped or a power converter accidentally overloaded. He met Elias's eyes for a fleeting second, and in that brief glance, a silent communication passed between them. An acknowledgement. A shared understanding of lines that shouldn't be crossed. The chaos was total. The storm was breaking, rain lashing down. The primary tool was destroyed. The light was gone. And then, from the south, another sound cut through the roar of the wind and waves. The unmistakable thrum of a powerful marine engine and the sweep of a searchlight cutting across the water. The Coast Guard. Sterling saw it too. His face was a mask of fury. His perfect, controlled operation had disintegrated into a disaster. He looked at Elias, then at the approaching boat, then at his men. He knew it was over. "Pack it up," he snarled. "All of it. Now." His men scrambled to obey, grabbing their gear and retreating to the trucks. Sterling gave Elias one last look, a look of pure, undiluted hatred. "This isn't over, Thorne." Then he turned and was gone, disappearing into the rainy darkness. Elias didn't watch them go. He limped out of the water and knelt by Ghost. He quickly examined the dog's leg. It was bleeding and likely broken, but it was a clean break. It could be fixed. He pulled the medkit from his pack and began to clean and bandage the wound as the Coast Guard cutter anchored just offshore, its searchlight bathing the scene in a steady, authoritative beam. He had made his choice. He had stayed. He had chosen the man, the partner, the friend. And in doing so, he hadn't lost the mission. He had fulfilled it. The truth was safe. And for the first time in a decade, the ghost of Corporal Evans in his memory was silent. The morning after was unnaturally calm. The squall had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of washed-out denim and an air of profound peace. The beach, which had been a scene of chaotic confrontation, was now a carefully managed site. The Coast Guard had established a perimeter, and a team of naval investigators in quiet, official-looking uniforms moved about the submarine with a hushed reverence. The Sentinel was no longer a secret. It was history. Elias sat on a log high up the beach, away from the activity. Ghost lay beside him, his bandaged leg stretched out awkwardly. A Coast Guard medic had given him a sedative and set the bone, assuring Elias that the break was clean and would heal well. The dog was groggy but calm, his head resting on Elias's knee. Sterling and his men were gone, intercepted by the authorities on the highway leading away from the Cape. Martha Galloway, true to her word, had made the call that had scrambled the cutter. Her anonymous tip perfectly timed. Dr. Finch was already on site, talking animatedly with a stern-faced female captain, his hands waving as he explained the significance of the find. He was in his element. Elias watched them all, feeling strangely detached, like a spectator at his own life. He had done his part. He had held the line. Now the official machinery was taking over. He felt the familiar pull of his isolation, the urge to retreat back to his cabin, to pull the silence around him like a blanket. The world had intruded, and now he wanted it to go away again.
He heard the crunch of tires on the gravel access road behind him. A rental car, an unremarkable gray sedan, pulled to a stop. The driver's side door opened, and a woman got out. She had his eyes. His sister, Sarah. She stood there for a moment, taking in the scene, the submarine, the uniforms, Elias sitting alone with his dog.
She looked tired, her face etched with worry. But she was here. She walked over to him, her footsteps hesitant on the sand.
"I got your message," she said, her voice quiet. "And then I saw it on the news this morning. They're calling it the find of the century." "It's just an old boat," Elias said, not looking at her. She sat down on the log beside him, leaving a small, respectful space between them. "No, it's not, Elias. I heard what you did. The journalist told me. You stood up to them. You saved it." She paused. "You stayed." That word. Stayed. It hung in the air between them. It was the word that had defined his failure, the command he hadn't given himself when it mattered most. Now it was being used to describe his victory. He finally looked at her. He saw the years of his absence reflected in her tired eyes, the pain he had caused by shutting her out. "Ghost was hurt," he said, as if that explained everything. "I know." She reached out, not to touch him, but to gently stroke Ghost's head. The dog stirred, letting out a soft sigh. "You chose him. You chose to protect him." She looked back at Elias, and her expression was one of understanding, a deep, sorrowful empathy that he hadn't seen in years. "It's okay to come home now, Eli. The war is over." He didn't know what to say. The words were locked behind a decade of disciplined silence. But he didn't turn away. He didn't retreat into the fortress of his grief. He just sat there, with his sister, on a quiet beach, while the world began to process the truth he had protected. It was a start. It was more than he'd had in a very long time. In the weeks that followed, the story of the USS Sentinel captivated the world. The sealed cargo hold was opened by naval experts, and its contents were exactly as Finch had predicted. A massive, meticulously documented archive of illegal domestic surveillance.
The tapes and films were a bombshell, implicating long-dead figures in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of a bygone era. The captain, a man named Alan Bryce, was hailed as a hero, a patriot who had sacrificed his career and his life to safeguard the nation's integrity from within. His final log entry was published, and his words, "a tomb with a message for the future," became a rallying cry for a new generation of government watchdogs. The crew, who had vanished into obscurity, were posthumously honored. Elias watched it all unfold from his cabin on the Cape. He gave a single, terse statement to the naval investigators, then refused all other requests for interviews. He wasn't a hero. He was just the man who had been there. The real hero was Captain Bryce. And, in a way, Ghost. He did not leave Cape Solitude. The pull to disappear was still there, but it was weaker now, countered by a new tentative anchor. Sarah stayed for a week, and their conversations were short and sparse, but they were real. They walked the beach. She helped him care for Ghost. She didn't push or pry. She was simply present. When she left, there was an understanding that she would be back and that he would answer her calls. The line between his world and the other was no longer severed. One afternoon, a few months later, Martha Galloway drove up to his cabin. She got out of her car holding a small, heavy box. "This is for you," she said, handing it to him. "It's from the Navy. Officially, it's a civilian service award. Unofficially," she lowered her voice, "it's from the family of Captain Bryce."
His daughter is still alive. She wanted you to have it. Elias opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of blue velvet, was a heavy, bronze ship's compass, its needle still pointing true north. It was old, beautifully made, the kind a captain would have kept on his desk. It was a piece of the Sentinel,
A piece of the truth.
"They're turning the cove into a protected historical site," Martha told him, looking out at the sea. "The town council voted on it. We're also expanding our local search and rescue team. We need someone with your skills, someone who knows this coast. If you're interested." It was an offer, a way to stay, a way to have a purpose that wasn't about running from the past, but about serving the present. He looked at the compass in his hand, then at Ghost, who was now walking with only a slight limp, his loyal presence a constant reassurance at his side. "I'll think about it," he said. But they both knew he had already made his decision. The submarine was gone now, carefully removed and transported to a naval museum where its story could be told. But its impression remained, a ghost in the landscape, a void in the cliff that only he could truly see.
Sometimes, in the evening, Elias would walk with Ghost to the edge of the cove and look down at the place where the Sentinel had slept for 30 years. He was no longer running. He had found something here he thought he had lost forever. A reason to stay. The sea had not scoured the rust from his soul, he realized. It had shown him that some things, like the hull of a forgotten submarine, were worth protecting, rust and all. And in protecting its story, he had finally begun to reclaim his own. The quiet of the Cape was no longer the silence of exile. It was the sound of peace. An earned peace.